Welcome to another edition of the Best Business Minds, where we interview business leaders and academics that write thought-provoking books. I'm Marc Kramer, a serial entrepreneur who works with family businesses and entrepreneurs. And today, we're very fortunate to have on our show Nancy Mcgaw, who is the author of Making Work Matter. Nancy, welcome. Glad to have you here. And can you tell us a little bit about your professional background and how you got to where you're at right now?
Sure. And Mark, thank you so much for inviting me to be in this conversation with you today. I'm really looking forward to it and appreciate those listening in online. So my background, I never imagined that I would have anything to do with business particularly. I started my career as an English teacher and did that for a couple of years in the US and also in Japan. Like you, I moved to Asia for a period of time, which was such a terrific learning experience and a lot of fun. When I came back from Asia, I did a master's degree in international relations. And at that point, the banks were hiring people with that kind of perspective and expertise. And so I joined a bank where I thought I'd be for a short time. And 17 and a half years later, left banking. And not too long thereafter, joined the Aspen Institute, where I had an opportunity to really think pretty deeply about what kind of leadership we needed in business. If we wanted business to really step up, to be a positive change agent in the world, to really provide opportunities for all of the people that are responsible for the success of a business. And while at the Aspen Institute, I became very interested in learning more about the kinds of innovators in business who really create this positive change. And so 16 years ago, I started a fellowship program called the First Movers Fellowship. And we sought to find people in business who were creating business value, but also positive social impact. And the book that I've written, Making Work Matter, really rests on the experience that I had over those past 15 years.
So, why did you write this book? And this is your first book, am I correct?
It is indeed. And writing a book, as you well know, isn't for the faint of heart. It takes quite a bit of effort. And this one was long in coming, but I really wanted to learn. I kind of learned into the book as I worked with more and more of these innovators in business. So I wrote the book because I wanted to tell the story of the First Movers Fellowship Program. And I wanted to share stories of the fellows whom I had the privilege of working with over a decade and a half. And I also wanted to make the book a guide for people working in business who really wanted to create positive change in their companies and to make their work matter. I wanted it to be the kind of book I wish I had had when I was a banker, because when I was a banker, we never talked about the impact that we were having on society. And I think I would have been a better banker and I would have been more engaged in my work if I'd had that opportunity to do that kind of reflection on why the work mattered.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the end of that.
Oh, we're having a little bit of technical difficulty. I said I really wanted the book to be a guide for people in business. I know there are lots of people who really want to do great work, to use their business acumen effectively, but in a way that really makes a difference in the world. And I want this book to be an inspiration and also to provide some tools that they can use to be able to do work that matters.
So, as you've been writing that book, and as I'm reading through it, in the context of corporate social entrepreneurship, which you talk a lot about in the book, how do you envision the balance between short-term business objectives and long-term societal impact within organizations? And what strategies can companies employ to ensure that both aspects are prioritized effectively?
I think there is always going to be tension in business and in other facets of our life, a tension between kind of the urgency of the short term and the possibilities of the long term. And leading companies are really not allowing themselves to be constrained by the imperative of the short term. And I think that, businesses need to outperform over the long term. And what I've learned over these years of working with social entrepreneurs in business who are thinking about this dual value creation is that they are helping companies imagine more ways that they can achieve long-term outperformance. Because I believe it's no longer possible to ignore the social and environmental trends that are influencing business success. And I think, there was a not too long ago, a study by BCG, the Boston Consulting Group, which is, of course, a global consulting firm, where they said if businesses really don't pay attention to these social challenges, they could actually undermine the system in which they need uh, to have in order to thrive. And so I think you ask about a strategy. I think the most important strategy is for businesses to ask different questions, to ask the kinds of questions that will prompt them to look at their business from a longer term perspective and to consider some of those social and environmental factors that really will influence their ability to thrive in the long term. And there are lots of these questions that I think sometimes get short shrift in the dailiness, the urgency of the daily. But they can't afford, companies who really want to thrive and outperform over the long term, they can't ignore these questions.
You mentioned the public sentiment has shifted regarding the role of businesses in society, and I hear that very strongly here in Vietnam. I mean, although it's a one-party system, the party has made this a high priority for them and the companies in Vietnam, and they have to have plans in this particular area. What specific mechanisms or practices do you believe are most effective for organizations to genuinely integrate social impact into their core business strategies? And how can they measure the success of these initiatives?
Yeah, it's interesting that we're having this conversation on the 5th anniversary of the Business Roundtable announcement. I don't know if your audience is familiar with this. The Business Roundtable is a group of senior CEOs from about 180 companies, all headquartered in the US. And 5 years ago this week, they came out with a statement that was a revision of the purpose of the corporation. And the CEOs signed on to this, that the purpose of the corporation could no longer be defined solely as the intent to maximize shareholder value. This new statement said that all stakeholders have to be considered, the customers and the suppliers and the communities. And we've now been 5 years on from that statement, and I think there's a lot of progress that's been made in terms of companies seeing this interdependence of social and environmental progress and their own performance over time. But there's still a lot more to be done. So what are some of the things that we're seeing companies do in order to really integrate the the importance of all stakeholders, along with shareholders. We're seeing that there are many changes that are happening at the board of directors level. For example, in some companies, we're seeing new committees being established that have direct responsibility for looking at these questions, these social and environmental trends and questions. We're seeing new collaborations within companies. I think it's very significant when we talk to a lot of change agents who are in the sustainability and environmental, social, and governance committees or departments in companies. There is a lot more collaboration across the company. So product designers and sustainability professionals are working more closely together. Finance professionals and sustainability experts are working more closely together. We're seeing secondments across these departments. And I'll just say, in addition to that, we're seeing some companies step up to making public pledges to change. And I think one of the roles that corporate social entrepreneurs can play is that they can help companies realize the commitments that they've made, because it's going to take a lot of innovation in order to achieve these results, like a net zero environmental footprint. I hope that
Yeah,
answered your
and
question, Mark, at least
yeah,
to
it
get
does.
started.
Yeah, no, it does. It definitely answers my question. And I know this is now that's affecting the bottom line. Companies are really focusing on this because they realize for long term, it's not something that you can avoid anymore. And we all know it and see it all the time. In chapter 2, you mentioned the role of personal purpose in fueling commitment to change. How can individuals effectively identify and articulate this purpose in a corporate setting, especially when organizational cultures often prioritize, understandably so, profitability over social impact?
Right. So I think the question of what individuals can do, I want to just set aside for just a minute. And I just want to say something about um, corporations and their need to be aware of how powerful personal purpose is in their ability to do well. I think a statistic that's often quoted is about how relatively few employees are truly engaged in their work. You know, it's pretty stunning that something like 20% of employees are highly engaged. And I think that's directly related to companies' commitments to really think about and do something about the intent of their employees to really do work that matters to them and that's very purposeful. And so companies need to really take on this question of our employees here, do they have a sense of meaning in their work? And, you know, Matt Breitfelder, who is the head of talent at Apollo, works with us on the design team for the First Movers Fellowship. And he's recently mentioned in a conversation with me that he sees this lack of engagement as a real, there's a real economic cost to that. And companies need to address this issue. From an individual perspective, I would just say a couple of things. First of all, I think it's important for all of us working in business to really take time to ask ourselves, what is it that matters to us? What is my personal purpose? And how can I really link into that purpose in order to empower the work that I do? And I say in the book that there are questions that we can ask as employees. One is, what really needs to change in my company that will achieve greater impact? And what's possible right now to change in companies? And then what change matters most to me? And that's really a personal purpose question. What change really matters to me? And how can I effectively use my skills and my sense of purpose in order to drive change? So I think that's a starting point for a lot of employees.
I think today, now I graduated college in 82, way before the internet really took hold, and you were limited in your options to where you could drive to. Now there is no limits, and the students, when they graduate, the questions they're now asking their employers, the best that the companies want to recruit. They want to know, how committed are you to environmental change, and how committed are you to helping me achieve my own professional dreams? Not for me to serve you, but if you're not going to help my career, then why am I here? I'm just, and this has come up all the time, even when we're teaching students
Absolutely.
at Vin University, and I think all the other Ivy League and other schools, and regardless of state school or any of the elite schools. Everybody is asking the same thing because they can work in Italy from Vietnam. They can work anywhere for anybody.
Right. That flexibility is stunning to those of us. And Mark, I'm sure you feel this too, who started out in a
Yeah.
very different environment. The flexibility is extraordinary and it gives you power as an employee.
I also think that my cousin told me that her son is thinking twice about having kids because he is concerned about what the future of the world is going to be. And he's not the first one I hear that. I hear my own students feel a high degree of stress because they feel the generations before them have totally mismanaged so many different things.
Yeah.
And now they're wondering, how are they going to make a difference? And I've been hearing this over the last 5 to 10 years, that these young, very, very smart people are really putting their mind toward this.
Yes. And isn't that a shame? We need more hope for the future of our
So
planet and people.
in the book, you write the stories of Marca, Andy, and John highlight diverse paths of discovering purpose. And you'll need to explain who those folks are. How can organizations create environments that encourage employees to share their personal stories and purposes, fostering a culture of innovation and social responsibility? And we've seen Harvard studies say that the more diverse the organization, the higher return on average. I think the return is 33% higher than organizations that don't have these diverse groups of employees. So what's your take on that? And maybe you can explain these folks' stories.
Right. So a brief summary of Marika, Andy, and John's stories, I think illustrate how varied a sense of purpose can be. Marika, who is currently at Mars, but when she was selected for the fellowship program was at Coca-Cola. Marika, as a child, her parents were also moved to Asia. She lived in Sri Lanka. And as a young child, it happened to be that setting where she became aware of the difference between the circumstances in which she lived and the circumstances of some of specifically of a woman who was there with a child on the street every day when she went to school. And that triggered for Marika a deep and lasting commitment to do work that really addressed some of the opportunities that people have in the world. And she has continued to do that in her career. Andy's a very different story. Andy is at a payroll company called Gusto now. And when we talked about purpose and he allowed me to share his story, it went back to his love of some of the martial arts and the kind of discipline and training that gave him. And he talked about how he brings that training, us, the importance of balance, the importance of listening intently, the importance of paying attention into the work that he does today. And John Thompson is back at H&R Block. He, as a young man, a technology expert, was given an assignment that asked him to think about how they could broaden the reach of their products. And what he discovered is that many of the people who used H&R Block services had extremely limited resources. And so the kinds of products that were being offered at the time really didn't meet the needs of those people. And he has dedicated his career to finding ways for financial services to be more inclusive and more impactful. So those stories are just meant to illustrate that people come at purpose from very different ways. And I think your question was, I think, around how organizations can help people discover their purpose and live it in their work.
Yes.
I would just say a very simple response, even though it's a much more complex answer, I think, than this. Try asking people why they do the work that they do. I think there's a huge role for managers here, and to be aware that that's something that they can do that will unlock potential of their colleagues, is to ask them, why do they do the work that they do? Aside from the importance, of course, of supporting yourself and your families, what else matters to you? And what can we do to enable you to work at your best, which often connects to that sense of purpose.
Question from the audience. Corporate America too often says they care not only about shareholder value, but also about other stakeholders. When profitability gets lower, downsizing comes quickly on the horizon. Another example is the gutting of DEI initiatives and more companies, which we read about every day in the Wall Street Journal. That is my experience, both as a shareholder in a wide range of U.S. companies, as well as an employee. What is your take on the hypocrisy of too many members of corporate America on that subject?
It's so true. It gets back to the short-term, long-term question. And we need to elevate more of the stories of companies that don't make that short-term trade-off. And also try to illustrate and demonstrate effectively to companies that these short-term measures, just looking at the kind of reflective action that companies take to cut staff, only to realize not long after that not having the people they need is a cost to them. We need more companies to really begin to look at the business case for some of these social and environmental issues. We talk about social and environmental concerns and practices as non-financial. I've never gotten that, because if you reduce your staff and then find yourself having to attract and retain and attract other talent, there is a cost to turnover. There's a cost to not attending to the well-being of your employees. So somebody's got it back to we've got to be asking different questions. But I agree, there is hypocrisy, and not all companies have yet understood that these short-term fixes, the tyranny of the quarterly reporting, can be harmful in the long term.
In your experience, what are some common challenges that corporate social entrepreneurs face when attempting to reframe problems, and how can they overcome these obstacles effectively?
So Thanks for that question. Reframing problems is actually something we do very intentionally with our First Mover Fellows. We offer seminars to First Mover Fellows. They're in 3 seminars in their initial year in the fellowship. And problem reframing is one of the things we emphasize. So first of all, why do we care about reframing problems? Because corporate social entrepreneurs are fundamentally concerned about the social and environmental problems that we face and trying to use the platform of business in order to be a partner in solving these problems. So we want them to think very carefully about problems and how they define the problems that they're working on. And what we find is that problem solving is rewarded in business. Of course, we need to be problem solvers. But before we become problem solvers, we need to be sure that we got the problem framed correctly. And so we provide a number of strategies that you can use to reframe problems. And you ask, what are the impediments? I think one of them is we try to go to solutions too quickly. We think taking time to really examine the problem and make sure we've got it framed correctly is going to be wasted time. In fact, you can save time by making sure you got the problem framed correctly. Another thing that inhibits us from reframing effectively is that we don't get enough perspectives. You can't be sure you really understand the problem until you've talked to a lot of people and gotten their insights. And I think another thing that hinders us as business people, we value expertise and we bring our expertise, and that expertise can sometimes inhibit you from seeing other possibilities. So I'd say, going to solutions too quickly, not getting enough perspectives, and letting your expertise actually inhibit you from seeing other opportunities to rethink the problem are some of the ways that, some of the things that inhibit us from reframing effectively.
So, Nancy, can you explain what the 5 whys technique is and how that's led to significant breakthroughs in understanding a problem and developing an effective solution, and maybe just a couple of examples?
Sure. So in the book, I talk about some of the problem reframing strategies that we offer up to our fellows. And one of them is this 5 whys. I think it's 5 whys is just a label essentially for root cause analysis. And the 5 whys strategy was actually first used by the founder of Toyota Industries, actually. And he was a very creative thinker about how to imagine new possibilities. And it's a technique now that's used extensively by designers, engineers, and first movers, social entrepreneurs. So what is it? You ask why, and you get an answer. And then you ask why when you have that answer, to go deeper and deeper. And the story I talk about in the book is about one of our fellows who, when she used this particular strategy, she was working at a bank in Asia. She was working on the philanthropy side, and she was tasked with addressing the challenge of absenteeism in schools. They wanted to provide some programs that would address this need. And so she got lots of different perspectives, and she kept asking why when she'd get a response. And the importance of this story is that what she was tasked with was to find a solution in the education space. And what she finally discovered through this root cause analysis was that the problem wasn't directly an educational problem. It was a problem of clean water and sanitation. And so she had a very different task once she got clearer on what this problem was. And she developed, I think, a partnership with Sesame Street and some others on hand washing and some other strategies that would address the sanitation problem, because what was happening is that students were absent from school because they were ill or family members were ill. I think that's just one illustration of how you can use this 5 whys effectively.
Navigational tools that you talk about in the book, you mentioned the importance of creating personalized maps for change when established processes not suffice. What specific strategies or tools do you recommend for corporate social entrepreneurs to effectively create and implement these maps in their organizations?
So when we started the First Movers Fellowship program, I had the great pleasure of creating a design team for this program. And I was thrilled when IDEO, which is a global design firm, agreed to join me on this venture of establishing a fellowship program for corporate social entrepreneurs. And one of the many contributions that IDEO made was to run a session on this question of how you create innovation in companies when your classic processes for getting a new idea implemented are really insufficient. And a couple of things that they helped the fellows do, which I can share here. One of them was, if you start by drawing the innovation strategies in your company, what does it take? What committees do you go through? Who do you have to talk to? Blah, blah, blah. And you draw that. And then you say, well, is that going to work for the kind of idea that you want to champion in your company? And generally it doesn't. So then you have to ask yourselves a number of other questions, like, what are the stories we tell ourselves in our company? What are the myths? What are the kind of corporate legends that either enable change or inhibit change? And so you become aware of those myths, and you can either use them as on-ramps to change, or you have to figure out ways to work around. In a classic change management structure, there are very definite people who have to sign off along the way. But for these kinds of innovations that entrepreneurs are interested in, often it's not those people who are really influential. And so you have to think about who the influencers are. Who do you need to talk with? Who do you need to collaborate with in order to see how this change could become possible? And you, the map is metaphorical, but your map, when you do this work, what are the stories you need to lean into? Who are the influencers? Who are people who can help you imagine how to bring this change to life? That becomes a way that you can think very differently about how you can work to achieve this change. And I think what it signals is that as an entrepreneur, you need to lean into this, your organizational savviness, really lean into what you know about how your organization works and be ready to collaborate. And you can map this out very differently than what the classic innovations structure looks like.
Measuring impact, you discuss the shift in public sentiment regarding corporate responsibility and the importance of drawing business case for social innovations, which you talked about in the beginning of this interview. What metrics or indicators do you suggest companies use to evaluate the success of their social initiatives beyond financial returns, which is probably the most important thing to them to justify why they're doing it anyway?
Yeah, and I think, the financial returns are important. And one of the things we do with fellows is we say, you've got to think about change in financial terms as well as social impact terms. But again, it gets to the short and the long term. So you need to think, for the idea that you want to work on within your company? You know, are there new markets that you can open? Are you avoiding risks? You know, sometimes we don't count things if they haven't already happened, but once they happen, the cost is enormous. You know, I think it's how can you beat the competition by looking at some of these possibilities for change. And I think in terms of metrics, I mentioned engagement scores. Is there something about what you're doing, the kind of change you're imagining, and getting other people involved in this process of imagining new futures? Does it affect the engagement scores, which companies look at? You know, I've heard people say we get a lot of data, but we don't have that many insights. Well, what is it telling us about whether people are more engaged? Looking at communities, are you getting trust in communities, and how do you measure that? And how do you look at the competitive landscape? Now, there are also a lot of things that are happening in the regulatory and disclosure space that are prompting companies to think very, very differently about the data they collect and the data that they share. And so I think this is a moment when, if you want to be an innovator within a company, there are probably new pools of data that can provide a much better look at these social impacts than what we've had in the past.
Can you elaborate on the concept of small wins and how they can lead to systematic change? And how do you measure the impact of these small wins in the context of larger social and environmental issues?
Sure. This is such an important part of our thinking about corporate entrepreneurship. And, you know, people who are listening on this call, I just ask you to think about what's a problem you'd really want to tackle? Is it climate change? Is it lack of inclusive content? Is it worker well-being? You think about these problems and you can get overwhelmed by them. They are massive. In some ways, some would say existential. And one of the readings that we do, which I recommend for everyone, is Carl Weick's seminal piece. It came out in 1984. I think it's called, well, I don't have it handy. Oh, yes, I do. Small Wins, Redefining the Scale of Social Problems. And small wins allow you to lower the temperature a bit. You don't have to solve climate change, but a small win can give you a result that gives you a sense of hope that you can build on that change. Dan Heath and Chip Heath, in their very important book, Switch, How to Achieve Change When Change is Hard, something along those lines, talk about the importance of small wins in shrinking the change. And these are things you can try to do that help you understand how to make change, how to begin to tackle these massive problems. Because the problems themselves, because they're so large, can disempower us. We can just feel powerless against the enormity of the challenge.
In the chapter 5, several fellows share their experiences with small wins. What criteria do you believe are essential for identifying a promising small win that can spark momentum in addressing complex problems?
A small win requires limited resources, time and money. It has a relatively low risk of failure. You don't have to sometimes you don't have to get all of the corporate approvals in order to do it because it's just a pilot. It requires a limited amount of time, and it's an experiment that you can actually try with others. So it's manageable. But I think what's really important about these small wins is that they need to be strategic. You need to see the importance of the small win in a much larger context. But it's interesting to just imagine what is something you could do now. You know, our colleagues at IDEO say, start small, start now. What is that next step that you can take that could help you imagine the step after that?
Um, the chapter emphasizes storytelling. How do you utilize storytelling in a way that people take these folks seriously? And 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 what's the elements that have to be in that story?
Right. I mean, you're a journalist. You could answer this question far better than I can. Um, we think that it's important, especially if you have a small win, that you are able to tell the story of that small win in a way that engages others so that they see it not just as a short-term victory, but as an achievement or a failure. I mean, the stories have to lean into the lessons learned and allow others to really think, how can I get engaged in this? How can I help address the issues that caused it to fail, if that's the case? Or how can I begin to build on the success that we realized in this pilot? And I think stories, are so important because they help us imagine much more than I think data does. And in a lot of cases, we need the data, obviously. But stories help make a small win strategic. And that's critical for building momentum for change.
Um, how can corporate social entrepreneurs effectively identify and engage with the right people in their organization when starting a new project, especially when they might initially feel isolated or unsupported, and they've got to get the right people on board or it's just dead?
Yep. First of all, I think there's a notion that if you're a social innovator within a company, you're a lone wolf. You gotta, just advocate like crazy and get others on board. And I think you ask, how do you find the right people? Well, don't make a judgment about who's the right person initially. Move into a stance of away from advocacy and into a stance of engagement. So take the time to reach out to people and ask for their input. And don't assume that a skeptic is actually somebody you ought to stay away from, because skeptics, not cynics, but skeptics can say that idea can't go forward, but because of XYZ. And sometimes what we hear is the no, it can't go forward. We don't listen for the XYZ. But that input is so critical to building out an idea. Your first idea isn't necessarily the best idea. This is really a collaborative effort. And so finding the right people is important, but you also have to ask the right questions. So you give people a chance to engage in some ways and to give share their expertise and their insights in order to imagine what could happen next.
Um, In today's fast-paced, technology-driven world, distractors are abundant. How can corporate and social entrepreneurs effectively combat these distractors and maintain their focus on active listening?
We are very big on listening. We're very big on curiosity. We think that's just absolutely critical for success if you want to be a social innovator. And you're right, distractions work against you. One thing I'd say is put your phones away. It's
Oh,
just simple,
that's so hard.
such a simple thing. When we meet with fellows in our seminars, we have a rule: no technology on the table. And it's very hard. If you need to take a call, leave the seminar room. But even when you're out with your partner and you're having dinner and this is your time together, and one of you puts that phone on the table, it's a signal to the other person, even if that person isn't looking at the phone, that the phone takes precedence. If the phone rings, it's one of those, oh, this will just take a minute, but that minute then disrupts the flow of the conversation. So that's a simple thing, but it's a very important thing. And another thing I would say in terms of a strategy for dealing with the distractions and prioritizing active listening is to just take a quick quiz. So ask yourselves, who are the 5 people in your life who are really, really matter to you and really close? Family, friends, workers, and rank them. Say, okay, on the scale of 1 to 5, 1 means I can always assume they're going to interrupt me and not really listen to what I have to say. 5 is that they can listen really with a focused attention, and I can count on them to really hear what I'm saying. And it's surprising when you do that. And then when you reverse it and you say, with those same people, how would they rate you? And it gives you a chance to reflect on your own commitment to listening and your willingness to put that commitment into practice.
Question from the audience. Many entrepreneurs often have to deal with resistance to change from middle managers and say either a director or senior director. Too often, middle managers fear entrepreneurs. Going around them could backfire badly. Many entrepreneurs either leave their employer to start their own company or get downsized in this type of environment. How do you convince your supervisor if he or she tends to fear or distrust entrepreneurs?
There's no easy answer to that question. Middle management, well, what I'd say is that it's important, first of all, to understand what the priorities are for the manager. And to try, and I know this feels like you're making more of the effort than that person is, but to try to understand what's driving their performance and what they have to be accountable for. And to try to imagine how the work that you value so much could actually fit within their sense of priorities. Managers are hugely important. They're important in engagement scores. They're important in so many ways. And it's really unfortunate that managers aren't better trained to give people an opportunity to express what matters to them and then give them some leeway for managing it. I think the best thing I can say, and finally, we know that people do get frustrated and they have to leave. And often we see that the commitments seem to be there in the executive suite, but they don't necessarily get translated to middle management. And so I would say, be sensitive to what's driving the response that you're getting from a manager. And try to engage them in the process of reimagining possibilities. I know this is much harder to do than to say. One of our fellows was trying to, a banker, trying to introduce a new product, a social impact product that would go to the market. These are very difficult to structure and complex. And he was advocating for it and getting a lot of resistance. And so he changed back to this importance of questions. He changed his approach. Instead of advocating, he turned to a question. He said, what would have to be true for us to be able to structure this product and take it to market? And possibly with a sincere question, you might be able to change or at least engage differently with that manager.
The concept of giving voice to values is emphasized as a crucial skill for entrepreneurs. What specific strategies can be employed to build moral competence and overcome the fear of speaking up in challenging situations?
Well, thanks for asking that question. I really want to give credit to Mary Gentili, Dr. Mary Gentili, who has been on our First Movers Design team since the beginning and has written extensively. Her book, Giving Voice to Values, and what I share in my book comes directly from Mary's work. And Mary asks this question. A lot of ethics training is about what do you do, what's right, what's wrong. And she says, with Giving Voice to Values, what she has dedicated the last 15, 20 years of her work to is to helping people when they know what's right, either to speak up against an ethical breach, or in the case of entrepreneurs, to advocate for an idea that's not the norm within a company, is to learn how to speak up in those situations. And she has lots of great advice. I'll just share a couple things here. And maybe that will be useful in thinking about, how do you do this when you know what's right? How do you actually step up? Or when you have a new idea? And I think one of them is that you really get clear on what matters to you. What are your values? You realize that these kinds of conflicts are the norm in business. Don't think that um, it's unusual to face this kind of conflict. Building the capacity to be able to act in the midst of these conflicts or challenges is a lifelong skill, so it's worth acquiring. She recommends practicing your arguments and also understanding and anticipating the kind of rationalizations that you'll hear from others. So it's about, in a sense, building competence before you even go into the situation where you're going to have to advocate. And also to find, she talks about finding a style that works for you. Not everybody is comfortable doing this ad hoc. Some people need to take time. But she has a lot of wise advice about how to speak up when you have a new idea or when you know when something's right.
In chapter 11, you emphasize the importance of mindfulness and meditation, uh, meditation for effective reflection. Can you elaborate on specific mindfulness practices that can be easily integrated into a professional routine?
Yeah, so there are 4 pillars to our First Movers program: innovation, community, the support of others, leadership, leading an idea in companies, and reflection. And reflection is, we know, not a luxury. It's an essential practice for accessing your sense of purpose, and looking at your actions and your beliefs in the context of your aspirations in your life. All of this is very important. And some people think, oh gosh, I've got to set aside a day, or I've got to, make sure once a week I do some kind of retreat process. I think with those expectations, you're probably never going to build practice in. So some of the strategies that I would recommend are just take small bits of time. Maybe you can block 15 minutes on your calendar once a week for reflection and mindfulness. Taking a deep breath is a powerful thing to do. Take a deep breath before you get on the next Zoom call and after you finish one. And just take a minute to think about the conversation that you've had and the one that's to come. I think another really important thing for reflection practices is to think in advance, what are the questions that you want to ask yourself? Because we talk about the importance of journaling. Journaling's great. You open up your journal and you think, okay, what do I do now? If you have a question that you ask yourself, and there are all kinds of things, how have I done this week? What's my priority for next week? How does that priority fit within what really matters to me? So I think there are ways in essence to squeeze reflection into very busy days. And you'll be more inclined to do that when you realize that reflection isn't a luxury. It actually helps you be a better parent, a better friend, and certainly a better professional.
This is probably final question because the hour went by super fast, and I really appreciate you spending the time with us. But the last chapter draws parallels between the journey of a corporate social entrepreneur, and a hero's journey in mythology. How can this perspective provide inspiration and motivation for those who are embarking on such a path?
Yeah, I love the hero's journey analogy. And it's with the hero's journey, the classic story is we've seen it in films, we've seen it in books, we've seen it in myth. You're disinclined to take on the challenge. And then you step in to this challenge and you encounter all kinds of difficulties along the way. You may have some people, some mentors, some Yodas who help you out. And you achieve a victory or you achieve a loss, but you have learned something in the process. And those lessons then fuel the next challenge that you're willing to take on. And I think it's a great analogy for corporate social entrepreneurs. This, this work of entrepreneurship, of trying to change companies in order that all of us can thrive and that companies can thrive is it's a long journey. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And so if you think of this effort in terms of the myth of the hero, and hero may be a little overwhelming because not all of us see ourselves as heroes, but it's a life journey. And take on the challenges, find ways to overcome these challenges, be ready to learn from success and failure, and then be ready to start again. And I think that analogy helps you stay on the path to doing work that really matters to you.
Nancy, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us, and I'm glad we were able to get through with a minimal amount of technology
Right. It
issues.
was great. Mark, I so much appreciate this opportunity. Thank you very much.
And the book was great, and it's really something that corporate leaders should be reading and thinking about and putting as part of the mix of their own strategy for long-term success. Because with each generation coming into a much more stressful world, this is top of mind to these folks. And the corporations who are going to make it for the long term, if they're not factoring this into the mix, um, they're just not going to exist because those people are going to build companies to compete against them and push them out of the game, right? That's what's going to happen at the end of the day. So thanks for doing great work at the Aspen Institute, and we're glad you guys are focused on this. Have a
Thank you
great,
so much.
wonderful weekend. Everybody be safe. and we'll look forward to seeing you all next Friday.
Thank you all. Great to be here.